Welcome back to Road to Gojira, the series where I go over various monster films that lead into the first Godzilla movie. We're nearing the end of this series, and the next film is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, a dinosaur movie that also has the distinction of being the first atomic kaiju film, depicting a prehistoric behemoth as a menacing giant monster. While it is well known in the kaiju community due to its indirect link to the movie that we are building up to, I don't think it is the first film to represent a dinosaur as a rampaging giant behemoth. I mean, you don't need me to remind you that The Lost World did this many years earlier, with a dinosaur as a terrifying colossal beast. However, it's not just the Brontosaurus or any of the other animals from that film. In early fictional media, dinosaurs were often viewed as these terrible giant creatures that some may consider as indirect forerunners of kaiju as we know them today. In case you forgot, the word kaiju in Japanese is the word for strange beast. These days, it tends to be used to refer to giant monsters, which both meanings fit in nicely with our prehistoric pals in early fiction. Nowadays, dinosaur media provides us with a more realistic portrayal of these now extinct animals, for the most part. However, things were very different in the beginning. In fact, upon discovering dinosaur bones and fossils for the first time, people mistakenly thought they belonged to giant humans, mythical dragons, or whatever mankind thought of them at first glance. In 1842, British anatomist Richard Owen coined the term Dinosauria, which means terrible lizard in Greek, and stated that the name should only be used for these now extinct animals, which by the time this name came into effect, only 3 dinosaurs were discovered. In the middle of the 19th century, when finding these ancient species was beginning to be regarded more seriously, not all of the bone fragments were there, which made it harder to determine what these things actually looked like. As a result, illustrators created these strange looking designs for these animals, based on what little skeletal remains of them there were. And they look very different from the dinosaurs we know today. Just look at Megalosaurus here. This is what people thought it looked like in the beginning, this is what they thought it looked like in the 1960s, and this is what we think it looks like now. And it's the same for many of our prehistoric pals here. Dinosaurs became more prevalent in fictional media in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they were typically portrayed as more larger and more aggressive than many people thought they were. Illustrators would occasionally monsterize their appearances, giving them these bizarre designs and portraying them as menacing giants. And wow, does this design look remarkably familiar. I mean, take a look at this illustration here for a 1940s magazine, and tell me you don't think of a kaiju when looking at this. Novels about these ancient creatures also began to sprout up, like Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and of course The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Are we not coming full circle here? The motion picture business eventually got into the dinosaur craze early on, only there was a big problem. How does one make a dinosaur movie? CGI is the obvious solution nowadays, but filmmakers during the turn of the 20th century did not have the luxury of that technology, so people had to get creative. Drawing these animals and describing them was all that was required for magazines, comics, and novels. But when it comes to movies, you kinda have to show a dinosaur in a dinosaur film. But of course that was more easier said than done. Since non-avian dinosaurs died out, you couldn't simply visit a zoo to see them or go to an exotic forest to record one, because they no longer exist. In the end though, filmmakers did produce them, but how were they created? There are 5 main ways into creating a dinosaur movie in the early days of cinema. One approach was to employ a life-size model, as seen in the 1914 film Brute Force, which features a Ceratosaurus. It's not really anything special, it just appears in this one sequence, and has as much movement as one of those drinking bird toys. When using props or even early animatronics for these films, the main issue is usually that they appear so lifeless and lack any personality, looking like an obvious prop being pulled by wires, or looking motionless with barely any animation. Speaking of animation, that brings us to our second method, traditional animation. The film Gertie the Dinosaur, which was released the same year as Brute Force, stars a lovely brontosaurus named Gertie, who is a much more playful and docile dinosaur than her film counterparts. But what I specifically want to talk about in this section here is a little Superman cartoon from 1942 titled The Arctic Giant. The plot is about a Tyrannosaurus Rex, yes that is what they're calling this here, being discovered in the Arctic. It gets brought back to civilization, it thaws out, goes on a rampage, Superman's on the scene. Now this short is interesting because if you watch it without knowing anything about when it was released, you probably assume it was a reference to Godzilla movies, in which a big monster runs loose in a city and armed forces are helpless to stop it. But you'd be wrong. This short predates Godzilla by about 12 years, thus Godzilla may have been paying homage to it. Probably not, but you never know. With cell animation, you can bring almost anything to life, including dinosaurs. There is another type of animation that can do this, and if you've been following this series, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Stop motion animation. Now this process of bringing inanimate objects to life is daunting to put it lightly, but when done correctly, the results are breathtaking. Now I've already gone over some of the more popular dinosaur movies from this era, such as The Lost World and King Kong. These films were all made possible by the master craftsman Willis O'Brien, who essentially defined the future of stop-motion monsters, and of course served as an inspiration for a young man we'll discuss later. Not only is O'Brien's animation wonderfully executed, but he also gives these creatures a great deal of personality and vitality. At the time, there wasn't much competition from other stop-motion animators working on dinosaur movies, like Herbert Dolly's Along the Moonbeam Trail and the 1951 film Lost Continent. Compare the dinosaurs you see in those films to O'Brien's, and yeah, it's pretty obvious who has the more stunning work. Not to put those other movies down, as stop-motion animation requires a significant amount of time and effort to produce, but you also have to make these lifeless figures feel alive for your audience, and unfortunately these non-O'Brien prehistoric monsters just don't cut it for me in that regard. Lost Continent, however, does feature one dinosaur that is unique amongst the rest. Now, that might have appeared to you as a simple lizard on a rock, but to the film, it was a dinosaur. Which brings us to our third option, the Slurpasaur. Now, some of you might be thinking, what exactly is a Slurpasaur? Well, it's a cinematic technique that uses real animals to portray dinosaurs, or whatever the filmmakers want them to be. In this case, modern reptiles were often used to play dinosaurs. And you will be surprised at the amount of times this method was utilized in so many early dinosaur pictures. Unlike stop-motion animation, this was quick to film and cheap to make. And this way of portraying dinosaurs was used way back in the earliest dinosaur films like Brute Force in 1914. For example, take a look at this thing and what do you think it is? Now the obvious answer is a snake. But take a closer look at its forehead. It has this weird crown thing on top of it. I assume it's there to make it look like a prehistoric serpent. What serpent exactly? Your guess is as good as mine. Or how about this? Could you tell me what dinosaur winged alligator is supposed to represent? You might have noticed that these animals have these strange attachments placed on them. It's a creative choice to give the false impressions that these animals are prehistoric beasts. Now look, I get it's preferable over a simple animal looking like itself, but come on. Most of the time in these movies, the lizards are just enlarged replicas of themselves, with nothing even attached to them. No horns, no fins, nothing. It's just a big lizard. So rather than a triceratops or a stegosaur terrorizing someone, you have a large iguana doing all the frightening. At times they would occasionally be held up by wires to make them appear to be standing, but this just results in this awkward slouch posing, all being done to these animals who clearly don't want anything to do with this. Oh, and by the way, this scene is from a film called King Dinosaur, with a poster that features what the story is calling a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Some creative liberties were done to the art here, but it's still pretty cool. Do you want to see what the T-Rex looks like in this movie? Okay, well let me just shift this away for you and... ah yes, I am not joking. Beware of the Iguanosaurus Rex. Now, many of these Slurpasaurus films were not good at all, but the 1940 movie, 1 Million BC, takes things to the extreme. The film itself is a straightforward caveman tale, and features a vast number of prehistoric animals, nearly all of which are enlarged or outfitted to appear as giants from ancient times. You got an elephant dressed as a mammoth, a bull as a muskox, an armadillo as a glyptodont, I hope I said that right, and of course modern reptiles betraying dinosaurs, who were sadly the most mistreated during the making of this film. If you've watched this movie, you'll realize that the reptiles being poked, buried, jumping, or even battling to the death are the actual animals being placed in dangerous situations. They are not props. Real animals were put in harmful situations or may have even died for this movie. And let me just tell you the methods that were used to coerce these reptiles into doing these actions. To get the lizards to jump around, an electric probe was used to give them a slight jolt that caused them to leap at things. The tegu and the alligator were allegedly starved in order to make them more aggressive when they were shocked and to provoke them into fighting, with the tegu severely hurt following the brawl, as you can even see in the movie. Sadly, this would not be the last time that actual reptiles would have to fight for the sake of a movie, with even Willis O'Brien of all people having to work with this outlandish method during his involvement in the Lost World remake in 1960. While this approach would definitely not be used nowadays, filmmakers who wanted to make dinosaur movies had either this, the alternatives we discussed, or the final method into creating a dinosaur film in this era, the suit approach. Now, many people immediately think of the Kaiju from Toho movies, or perhaps the giants from the Ultra series, when they think of guys in costumes playing giant monsters. And that's no exception to some of these early dinosaur movies in cinema. But believe it or not, there weren't many dinosaur movies that employed this method prior to the first Godzilla story. Despite its overusage of Slurpasaurs, 1 million BC did have a man in a costume playing a dinosaur, though the film's so-called Tyrannosaurus Rex is unlike any T-Rex you've ever seen, with it only being somewhat taller than a normal person. Your average Tyranno is normally around 15 feet tall, so what the hell is this? The size of these prehistoric creatures was always going to be a significant obstacle for the filmmakers to overcome. Tabletop miniature sets can be made, but they will only be useful for stop-motion models, or in some situations, Slurpasaurs. So how can a man in a suit be made to look gigantic? This is where we turn to Unknown Island, a quite notorious dinosaur movie from 1948. Some of you might even remember these wobbly creatures from their stock footage cameo in the American version of Godzilla Raids Again. Yes, that footage was from a real movie, and these were the actual dinosaurs from it. The premise is okay. It's essentially a Lost World ripoff with explorers discovering a hidden island full of prehistoric animals. But the standouts are these suited creatures, which include Tyrannosaurus Rexes. Yes, that is what the narrative refers to these things as.
Flesh-eating Tyrannosaurus, giant lizards.
Boy, this one creature had a huge identity crisis back then in early cinema. You also have this enormous sloth creature that ends up fighting one of the Tyrannosaurs, which most people jokingly like to point out that this is the true King Kong vs. Godzilla fight, before the actual King Kong vs. Godzilla fight. It's as spectacular as it looks. Anyway, production work on the suits is something else. Not only could the suit performers not move the arms of the creatures, but they couldn't even see out of these things, and it was unbearably hot inside them. I'm sure most of you have heard stories about how difficult it can be to be inside a Godzilla suit, but being inside one of these things is just as bad, if not maybe a little worse. As previously mentioned, the suit actors had no way of seeing out of these things, and whenever they needed a break, they had to remain inside their suits and rest on crew members, all while filming outside in Palmdale, California's desert, and temperatures around 100 degrees. One of the most bizarre things I've read about this film is that the suit actor in the scene where one of the Tyrannosauruses falls actually passed out and subsequently died from severe heat exhaustion. Although I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, I did get that from IMDb. I also heard some say that the actor just merely fainted. But despite the situation, it just serves to highlight the fact that there are risks associated with simply being in a monster suit, which we'll discuss further when we reach the Big G himself. But despite those problems, how well does the movie actually make the creatures appear big? Well, it's not very good. There is absolutely no effort here. There's a few matte shots, but the creatures don't look or feel gigantic in their surroundings. They literally appear to look like guys in suits stumbling around like morons. Okay, so we've gone over all 5 methods, but you might have noticed that the majority of the films I've discussed in my Road to Gojira series feature stop-motion animation, which at the time was essentially the best way to bring these animals back to life and truly make them feel alive, at least in terms of live action. As you all should know, Willis O'Brien was the master craftsman behind many of these early dinosaurs in cinema. The man that truly made them feel alive, with them breathing, wandering around, and of course, battling to the death with one another. There was nothing like the wonder he brought to the world of cinema dinosaurs at the time. His work in the field of stop motion was so captivating that it did in fact inspire a young child who would go on to become a legend in the world of stop motion animation. That legend is Ray Harryhausen. Ray Harryhausen was born June 29, 1920 in Los Angeles, California, and grew up loving film, art, literature, music, and of course, dinosaurs. Harryhausen's fascination in prehistoric life began at an early age. He loved the 1925 Lost World film, Charles R. Knight's paleo art, and of course, going to history museums to witness the remains of these once great animals firsthand. Then one day in 1933, his aunt offered him and his mother tickets to see an odd movie titled King Kong. As Ray viewed the film, he was awestruck by what he saw, particularly Kong, the mighty ape, and he wondered how such a creature could have been created, as he knew it obviously wasn't a man in a costume. But however it was made, he was tremendously motivated by the picture to pursue a career in filmmaking. As he would often state in interviews, it was the movie that changed his life.
I just came out awestruck, and I realized what you could do with animation. I mean, it changed my life.
There was one major issue though. Ray had no knowledge of how the movie was even made, and he was aware enough to know that any information that existed at the time about the film should not be taken seriously. This brings up something that we often take for granted nowadays, gathering information about a movie. Depending on what you want answered, you can just look it up on your phone, but Ray obviously couldn't do so in the 1930s. To gather such material, he had to go to museums, libraries, and even supermarkets for magazines containing publicly available information about filmmaking. Ray delved into and examined every movie trick he could come across. He even studied about renowned stop-motion filmmaker Willis O'Brien, and even came across magazines that described the fundamentals of stop-motion animation. He even went to night school to study up on filmmaking and editing. After everything he learned, Ray began making his own stop-motion models at the age of 15. Similar to O'Brien's early creations, these models featured primitive wooden armatures with ball and socket joints created from beads, along with other material from around his house, including cutting his mother's own fur coat for a cave bear's pelt. After that, Ray started filming his own stop-motion videos, using a 16mm camera that he had borrowed from his friend. Naturally, these initial attempts involved a great deal of trial and error, but Ray never backed down from the challenge, and always came up with ideas to solve issues or advance his craft. He was so dedicated to filmmaking that he ultimately converted his parents' garage into his own small studio, which he often called his hobby house. He eventually bought his own camera, honed his artistic abilities, studied static matte shots, and even began production on his first independent film, titled Evolution of the World. The premise would follow the story of life on Earth according to evolution, describing the whole Earth's life story from the beginning of the stars to the arrival of humans. The narrative obviously included dinosaurs, and of course you can probably guess what Ray wanted to focus on first. Ray spent a significant amount of time on the project, over a year and a half at that. But sadly it was all for naught, as he soon viewed Walt Disney's Fantasia, particularly the Rite of Spring segment, presenting a similar idea to the goal of Ray's Evolution project. Feeling that Disney had already outdone him, Harryhausen had to sadly cancel the project, believing that the idea was too large for one individual to manage. Ray wasn't deterred by the abandoned project for very long. In fact, it helped him realize his limitations as an independent filmmaker, being aware of how far one can go from where he was at now. Realizing that if this was going to be more than a hobby, he must continue growing and honing his talent. As for evolution of the world, the finished footage was used by Ray as a showcase for his skills for potential future projects, which did indeed help him down the line. For many people, Ray Harryhausen is a true inspiration, not only for his future creations, but also for the steps he took to achieve them. Learning, developing, receiving support from both friends and family, and simply continuing to evolve, not only as a filmmaker, but as a person. An individual who is always proactive, making errors, learning from them, trying new things and seeing how they would help him in life. And of course, never giving up on his dreams. Ray had always wanted to make his own King Kong film, much like his hero Willis O'Brien, whom he eventually got to meet. Not only did he study under Obi and work with him on projects, he eventually surpassed him, all beginning with a unique kind of dinosaur picture, one that was essentially Ray's own King Kong monster film, a movie that one could say truly exploits a dinosaur as a kaiju before Gojira.